we are launching a series of conversations about community. What is community? What is it for? And what enables communities to thrive? And today I'm naturally with Jane to begin this exploration. And to the best of my knowledge, Jane, you have been involved most of your adult life in communities. And perhaps a good place to begin is if you could offer some context and also some high-level insights from your experience about what makes communities work well and what enables them to thrive.
That's quite a broad introductory question. Where I'd start is looking at describing community. And people think of them in such different ways. I'd want to say that I was raised in a community. Each of us was raised in a community. Specifically, I can say it was a community of people who lived in a certain radius around where our home was, and they watched after us. One of the aspects is we'd go out and we'd play in the streets all the time. We'd be outdoors. It was a safety. It was the adult eyes from the other homes were looking out at you. There's that, as well as community to do with belief systems. So I was in that type of community as well. And I remember when our oil furnace blew up, different families took each of the children to live with them until we could be back at our house, and someone else with my mother. So, that's community. And then there was a community, there was a place I went after school every day for activities, to whether it was arts, crafts, theater. And that was a community. Then growing up, there were, things kept evolving about what is community. And until you asked me this about sitting down with me for an interview, I hadn't really thought about how it encompasses a life in so many ways. And it's that sense of belonging. So going on to other community, there is, when you're a child, the school, your classroom's your community, the school you're in. If you play sports, that's your community. And on it goes when you are in college. That's, if you're in college or high school, that's a community. And the people who study the same subjects, let's say you're looking to go into a specific field, journalism, or you're looking at pre-med, or you're looking at theater, those are all communities inside of the college community. Then it's, if you have any religious or spiritual beliefs, that becomes a part of your community. And one of the aspects of community is how you develop identity around it all.
Well, so let me just pick these earlier threads of your story, which I can naturally recognize. Born and raised in a kibbutz in Israel, certainly a community in which there were many wonderful things, in spite of the recent 2-3 decades with the various books coming about what was it like in those early days in the kibbutz, which for some reason or another choose to highlight that when you were raised away from your parents, it impacted negatively your psychology, which possibly is correct by the research, but I can at least offer the testimony of a wonderful upbringing. I can also offer the testimony of what not to do in a community and the allergies and the dysfunctional part. I think the interesting, and by the way, we could spend a whole other conversation about the kibbutz. That's not the focus of of my inquiry here today. I'm more interested to come into this through the lines of your experience. What is interesting, even in the way you recount the beginning, many of those early communities are communities you find yourself in.
Yes.
You didn't elect, you didn't choose. You may have chosen the subject area in college, but you didn't construct an intentional community. That comes later in your life when you get involved in those type of endeavors where now there is more of a specific intention that accompanies the idea of community.
Yes. And that brings me personally to college days where there was community, something called a farmer's market. Most people are familiar with farmers markets. And that was a type of community because everyone came for the same purpose, to come together in one place where others could come and buy your produce. And that was a type of community, as well as in many grassroots communities I was involved in. You can say food cooperatives, and starting those to do with local and giving, assisting people locally in the idea of economy. And inside of that, you're there for the same purpose. You chose it. And if you're part of the cooperative that it is, you're agreeing to, well, in one aspect, put certain hours in, volunteering hours. You're giving of yourself for something else to flourish.
So you're describing variety of settings and variety of reasons or motivations or needs that bring about a community. Sometimes
Yeah.
economic needs, sometimes other needs. And you're highlighting already that there is an element of volunteering of your talent, volunteering of your resources or time, that is part of the, I imagine, the glue or the currency or the strength of a community. That there are different individuals who, for one reason or another, say, let's do something together at the most foundational, simple level.
Yes.
So what else? What else are you then discovering? And is there a point where you become more consciously aware or intentional in how you think about communities?
Well, I want to say that each of the experiences open doors for what you're saying to do with greater understandings about human beings, greater understandings about organizations. And you can say a struggle between, I'll say, possessiveness and freedom that you see in many of them. Giving an example, I was recently part of a community for some years that had to do with giving opportunity to children who many didn't have the best environment at home. So it was creating opportunity for them to be able to flourish, a nourishing community. And it's an excellent community. And at the same time, they want everyone to believe the same thing. They're not interested in the independent thinking. What can really make something flourish outside of a narrow band? And also not wanting to see some of the things that are, you can say, their ideals that they are short of practicing.
So in this example, you're talking about a team of people building or setting in motion a community environment for young adults or for youth So there is one side that's managing and creating the ecology, and that's where you talk about, I think you said possessiveness and freedom. I don't know if you meant it in this way, or you'd say control and freedom as the polarity that often plays out in a community.
And I think control is a better word in some respects. The reason I said possessiveness is more to do with the undercurrent of you are part of that family. So you're meant to behave in certain ways. There's certain things that I want to say inside of there's a danger to me, because there's ways of going on that are ignored because of it, that aren't healthy. Now that's my point of view.
Yeah.
So it works for that community, yet it didn't work for the principles of my life. So after 4 years, I stepped aside, which is fine. And I think that's also the beauty of many. It's for a part of your life. And each part, I can say, I learned so much. And it was of great value, and I have no regrets. And most of all, you learn about yourself.
Okay, we want to unpack all of it, the learning of what works and the learning about yourselves through the interaction in a community. Before we go there, to just move it forward on the timeline and to sense a little bit into the area that I'm inquiring with great interest into, which is the idea that adults, sometime in their 20s, sometimes in their 30s or 40s, sometime even later, choose to embark on building a unique community. And of course, we have to say, for many people, the word community these days purely mean a virtual community, something they participate on Facebook or any other platform. And so there is that on the very diluted or loosely affiliated end of the continuum, all the way to the more intentional residential community, such as the one you got involved in and helped develop in Tennessee. So, what would you say to offer some insights and reflection onto those communities I'm inquiring about, where adults can choose to be part of a community, can choose to actually bring about a community?
Right. And that actually is very specific in ways, as you're saying, it's intentional. And what you're speaking of here, and myself, it's an intentional residential community. We spent a small group of us, a core group, 2 years working out what is the purpose of it, what are the principles of it. Because looking at communities that are residential, and I was part of a residential community years before, you see all of what doesn't work. Of course, isn't that what happens? You see what doesn't fit. That's what our senses are looking at, what's different. And so we spent much time building, you could say, a platform to be able to invite the growth of a community. And it was even inside of that where they were seeing where we had differences and letting go of them. One example is where would this community be located was a question, and there was not agreement on it. It was very curious, where if you're starting a community and you're doing it with only people you know, and you're looking to stay where you've been all the time, so it's, you can say, where you are financially stable, where you have friends, you have, everything that you've built over the years. what became very clear is then you're really not inviting others in to start something with you. You're inviting others in to come into your thing. That was a point we needed to get past. That if you want to start something new with people you're inviting from, we were inviting people from a large organization to be part of it, that it needed to be a fresh start for everybody. That is an important feature in the founding of something. And then, of course, people come in later. It takes many years to found something and establish it. It's not quick at all.
So you're saying you spent 2 years working to discover and define and agree on what would be the purpose. That's before the site was found. That's the development journey before the development begins. It is said that to start a development journey, there has to be a development journey before it that precedes and enables that development journey. So let's just pause with this for a minute. What is some of the learning from that earlier phase of just harmonizing different ideas, different dreams, I suppose, different visions, and whether codifying it or not in language, and even when the words are written on paper or on screen, whether the words mean the same thing to the people involved or not, all of the above. What are some learnings from that?
One, I'd say the importance of taking whatever time it needs without pressure, but to keep at pressure. You can't say, put a timeline. We need to know by, 7 months from now. It doesn't work that way. It's a natural process that, depending on the team, is how long it takes, because you need to come alongside one another. That takes time.
There is a natural birthing process, and in this case, the different hopes, aspirations, value sets, agendas, they need to rub against each other.
Yes.
and harmonize. I imagine there are many attempts that never really get off the ground. They meet the wall of impossibility at that earlier stage, or they settle to not really agree on anything and proceed into more of the practical experiment, only to discover that they are now facing all those elements they did not work out before. So what else was part of that earlier phase? Was there anything about decision making? Was there anything about agreements about ways and means, behavioral sciences, or all that was left for later?
All that was left. That's almost like the second phase. We didn't start there. We looked at each of our hopes and aspirations for it, the reasons why it was important for us, looking at what would it look like 5 years from then? What would it look like 10 years from then? What were the most important features to have as part of the community? And that even goes into touching upon, is it rural? Is it urban? Is it in a suburban neighborhood? Is it on some land that is more secluded? It's looking at what's its involvement with as well, part of it. What will its involvement be with the larger community around it, which is as well part of what's its purpose, drives what that might be. There was something that when you were speaking a minute ago that came in, there was a group of people that asked to meet with two of us here after we had been here, I want to say 4 or 5 years. They were looking to start a community, a residential, intentional residential community. And so they had been here, a couple of them, and thought, wow, these people have it together. Of course, we laughed, but we're not going to. So we did a day with them on the important things to look at before you embark on a residential community. And so you can say we gave them a handbook with a lot of exercises at the point and then to go home. A month later, they got in touch with us and said, we decided, thank you very much. And we decided we would never make it as a community.
What are some of the exercises that and inquiries that you offer them?
Well, if I could go back, I think some of it is what I was just speaking of to start with. So in this instance, for someone, it was very important that it be more like an eco-village.
Right.
So that was its focus. For someone else, they wanted it urban. For someone else, it was more to do with farming. And it's not that all of those couldn't be involved in it, but what happened was they did not have a central focus, a central purpose that would be able to support all of the different interests they had.
Okay, you just articulated a very important principle. Let me slow it down and say it back to you in my words. A community can be, in this case, an intentional residential community, can be an ecology that will support many interests, many endeavors, many inclinations. But for the community to actually thrive, there has to be some kind of a unifying idea or theme or impulse that bring people together, all while it enables those various interests and pursuits and desires and hopes to have a space to be integrated. Because if there isn't a unifying principle, then why on earth are you trying to build a community? Well, this is a potent inquiry. So what would you say now, a few years later, is some of the learning that joined you as you proceeded in this journey? Because I imagine there were ups and downs and struggles and moments of breakthrough, but it's a journey that never ends. It's a journey where you're forever on the edge of discovery of what the next chapter is going to be about, I imagine.
Exactly. That's what I was going to say. It's just as your life is a journey, never ending until your last breath, so is a community. And you can say that for 20 years, this community has been on its journey, almost 18 years being on the land. And so many different things have been learned. I'd start from more of the external, and that is moving to a place you haven't been before, and everyone coming from somewhere else to a town no one lived in. It takes time for you to acclimate to the ways of the culture that you have brought yourself to. And it takes time for the people who are resident in that larger community because you're foreign to them. And it takes time for those who come to live in the community, the residential community, because not only, again, the locals are foreign to you, as well, the land. The essences that radiate out from the land as well need to get to know you and you them.
And just to be more concrete, some of you came from the Seattle area and other people came from the Northeast or from the New York area, and you landed in some rural part, almost in the middle of nowhere. I don't know if that's a fair description, but it is certainly a rural area in the middle of Tennessee. So what you're saying
Yeah,
is the ecology was very different. The nature of the land and what it encourages is different, and the greater, larger population community around is different by, well, certainly by socio-economic, political, and any other aspects in some ways, other than we're dealing with human beings, where we discover that we have often more in common than not when we slow down and give ourselves the permission to discover that.
exactly. Inside of that, people did come, as you were saying, all from urban areas. Most people had never lived rurally before. And it is rural. I wouldn't say no out, out nowhere, so to speak. I've lived more rurally. So for me, it wasn't as rural as for others. Yet it's definitely rural with a different pace of life, different pressure system. And think about those who have, those when someone retires or someone's life all of a sudden changes. It's not that it really all of a sudden changes, it's a point of departure from one thing into the entry of another. And it takes years to acclimatize. You have heard from people who have retired that, it might be 3 years before they come to a point of, okay, now I have a better landscape of things. I'm not pulled by all my patterns and all the magnetic ways of going on of all of the years that I work. It takes time. Not only where we moved, but all of a sudden you think you know people, but you don't know people until you live with them in the same way, I should say. And you still don't know another life fully, but you get to know more of them when you live in close, very close proximity.
So you came to the place, you spent 2 years in a preparatory journey, and you framed some intentions. And now you come to the ground and you begin to build some practical reality. And whatever was on the sketch and on the drawing board and or on the purpose statement is confronted with the ground reality. And we're seeing each other in the morning and in the middle of the day and sometime in the evening, even though if the houses are not close to each other, you don't necessarily see everybody all the time, but you confront the individual and the practical realities of each person and the collective that you're trying to build. And what I'm interested in is how inside that crucible, the aspirations, the intentions, and even the appreciation of what the purpose is continues to evolve and refine, and what is it you are learning about yourself and about each other.
Whatever you need to get to where you're going is different than what you need once you're there. And that's easy to say, and you can tell people, yet until you experience it, the all of you doesn't get it. And some lives resist it. And when a life resists it, what very often happens is you can say the purpose of the project or the endeavor, or in this instance, the residential community, you are aside from it. And it can be very difficult and it takes time. And for each person, it's a different amount of time because everyone comes with expectations. It's normal. Yet it's having to put those expectations aside, as you were saying, to what's the reality of the day to day. So not only is it that way for each individual, now think about, let's say you were able to do it immediately and I wasn't. So then it's to do with our relationship and how, if you were able to, how do I give someone else the space and the time to come to that as well? That's an example, and that's with everything in a community. It's not that someone's going to agree with me, and I hope not always do people. Of course, we want them to, but at the same time, you don't, because you need that resistance of having argue stretches and to try to get to my way isn't the way. What is the way? What is the greater purpose? And can I come around that?
Well, let me just bring into it because I imagine one of the areas, one of the naturally arising areas of struggle in every community, there is, okay, so there is the individuals and individual families, and there is the community. And where is this line drawn? And what are the agreements about what is the community space or the community endeavor or the even investment in shared facilities and properties that require some kind of agreements of how to go about those. These, I imagine, are some of the naturally arising areas of healthy, constructive, naturally arising tension, because different
Yes.
people have different priorities and different hopes. And one person wants to invest in a swimming pool, and another person saying, well, now can we build a larger meeting space so we can hold different kind of activities, including dance parties or large conferences? I imagine that is some of the areas where there would be natural argue stretch and tension.
And I'd have to say for us, there was not many in that area at all. Yet we did spend the first 2 years here, as well as putting electricity and plumbing in the houses that were here, which was quite a feat. And we volunteered, we put so many hours into assisting, making it happen. And that's part of what helped build the strength of the community, is all the time we spent together readying not only the public buildings, facilities, but assisting others in with their homes.
Okay, so that's an important point you're making. Once you are engaged in the practice of building a community, every moment, every challenge, every effort, every construction project is twofold. There is the project you're dealing with, which is plumbing or a community building, and there is how is this project by itself a theater for getting to know each other better, getting to know each other's strengths, supporting each other, challenging each other, and essentially forming the community and developing the community in action rather than just on philosophical terms. That's what I'm hearing.
Definitely. And even to do with our legal documents, we spent quite a lot of time on the legal documents. And instead of using the language that are the templates of legal documents for the corporation we formed, and as well the cooperative in under the umbrella of it, a group of us worked for quite some time to come to what would fit what we are and what we see it to be for its safety and security, not my safety and security, the residential community's purpose, safety and security in the long term. And then I can say we'd spent, I think it was 2 years finalizing those documents once we were here. And years later, we went and we looked at them again and updated them, because we wouldn't have known then what we did know, let's say 7, 8 years later. And to this day, we look at this needs updating. This needs updating, because every step of the way, you're understanding more.
Can you give me any kind of an example just to get a bit of the concrete sense of something that either you update it or something that 7 years in and 14 years in, there was a new realization or a new perspective that promoted a reason for an update.
Well, it's trying to take my mind more into the legal aspect of it, but there's many things with updates. So I can even say, as far as use of some of the community buildings, we had one building, which is the first one that was worked on, and it was a guest house. The first thing we got ready with electricity and plumbing was not one of our homes. It was the guest house. And it was the guest house for years. And that is the way, so this isn't a legal part, but it was for years, that is the way it went on. And then we saw that we were having some events, seminars and workshops, so we were using it for that. We had volunteers who came for some months, we'd use it for that. And the lay of the land changed in the last years, especially the last year. And what was seen was, for the growth of the community and what it needed, and for what the runes were telling us, it would no longer be a guest house. So it's now in the process of becoming an office building. And having already moved in there just recently, you feel, wow, what took us so long to get to that? It's just perfect. You feel it's, when you make a move and it's the right one, all of a sudden doors open. It's like fresh air has come in. You can see things you couldn't have seen before.
So as you reflect, and you may also have in mind somebody who is like the group that came to you, thinking about communities, and again, many people think about a community and they mean a Facebook community, which has its place as well. But suppose somebody is thinking about more of this idea of an intentional community. What are some, you already alluded to some, but what are some of the other challenges or pitfalls or obvious considerations that people need to take into account that will simply present resistance along the journey?
I can only talk from this perspective of the type of community we have, because there are communities that are religious communities. There's communities that are commune communities, meaning all of their finances are pooled and everything is community. There's nothing individual really, in many ways about it.
And
then there's
in your case, that is not the case.
No. For us, we each have our individual homes. Financially, we are independent, yet we all contribute towards what we call the common land and the common building, or you can say the community land and the community buildings. So the domain, we call it, that I live on, I am responsible for keeping it to a certain standard. And each person is. And then there's all the land around us. We're on quite a lot of acres. We're on over 110 acres. And we each contribute in different ways to the upkeep of that. And it's not that, and here's part of it, it's not that you have to put in 5 hours a week of volunteer labor. I mean, this is one of the things to watch out for, or rules. Ways and means and agreements are very important. As few of them as possible. There's one community that I was interested in seeing how they go on, because I thought they were fascinating, and they've been for quite a while. Their rule book was like 6 pages. And I would steer people away from that. We're humans. We need to, it's really not, we don't need to. The better way forward, I believe, is learning to work things out between one another on the run. And if something comes up that there's a disagreement about, to come together and to find, why is there a disagreement? And what is it against the purpose or the mission, you can say, of, for us, this residential endeavor?
That's a tall order. You're describing an awareness whereby essentially what you're saying, if you're going to try and set rules to address all future needs, two things are going to happen. First of all, you will fail because you cannot predict all the challenges. Second of all, you will try to live by a set of rules. It will become inhibiting and controlling environment rather than one that is liberating and inviting for people. But the essence of what you're describing is, instead of trying to solve your challenges with rules, try to ground yourself in a purposeful intention and let yourself work with others through that first principle consideration, the purpose and the intention, and see if you can use that as a source of inspiration and reasoning to work out through things. What I'm describing for somebody else that has not gone through the experience would sound either insane or impossible, or will require that we sit sometimes for 100 hours to work through an issue and not find a resolution in the end. So, okay, so.
We haven't found that the case. Okay. And one thing I'd like to say is, part of that is when you're working something through, and let's say it's a big something and it's not just with two people, you don't start there. You start with re-enlivening the purpose. Because very often the problem is that it's been weakened because let's say 3 people have been in their own struggles and they're just not as much in the life of the purpose at that time. And that's understood. We all go through ups and downs. So you spend the time and you don't as well focus on the specific people. You spend the time as a community. It might be 3 hours, it might be 4 hours, meeting twice, 2 hours each time, to enliven the reason why people are here and what the community is about and what that means about what we support. Early on, something came up about dogs. Some, not early on, but dogs are quite something. You can say animals, but dogs. And I had a dog at the time too. So I'm not a dog, anything about it. And some people don't feel safe with dogs running up to them, jumping up on them. Some dogs, when you get 2 dogs together, they can fight. So we had, I think it was 3 meetings, about 8 hours total, about ways and means to do with dogs. And we kept meeting until we could come to agreement. We try to never bring something to a vote until it's going to be a consensus.
Wow. So the consensus approach.
Sometimes it's not a consensus, but it's a vast majority. You're really not going to be able to go forward with just a majority on anything. It hasn't really been agreed to.
Yeah, so if we take a metaphor from the field of health and healing, the approach you are painting, where instead of attacking the problem to fix it or solve it, what you do, you invest in what presents in the first place nourishing, replenishing, rejuvenating set of processes or conversations for people, which is a metaphor to if somebody is struggling, instead of thinking that your job is to heal them or heal or address the problem, The other approach would say, well, what can you do to strengthen or boost the life force, the revitalizing of your system, such that you are then in a better position to address whatever that health challenge is. You're describing similar approach, similar strategy in terms of a community endeavor. If we hone in on the problem and focus on the problem and think by magnifying the problem even larger, we will always solve it in the fastest possible way. What you discovered now, it's the purpose that brought us together. Can we come together to regenerate, to rejuvenate ourselves in light of the purpose and draw inspiration from that to then use it to address the various disagreements or challenges? Am I describing that?
Another thing you were saying, which can be a pitfall, and this is where we can help one another. We always help one another here. Is it's easy to think you know what's better for someone else than they do. Oh, and so it's one of those we're very cautious of. And so if someone hears me saying it, they have, they have the right to basically, Jane, think twice about that, what you just said, or however they might say it, because we are each independent lives. We each want each other to thrive and to flourish in the purpose of their life. And we're here to support one another in it and to talk about people behind their backs, or to think you know more what they need than they do, rather than when someone's in a struggle or you think it's their struggle, to send them the best, to think about the best qualities they have and the things you support in them, to give them the strength to overcome wherever that they are with the struggle.
So two practices that you're highlighting there. One is the practice of holding for each other their best,
yes,
rather than their worst. And the second practice is the discipline of mind of not taking away from the other person their struggle. Because how do you know that what the other person is struggling with is not the very lesson or learning or development they are here to acquire? And if you think it's your job to take it away from them because of your good heart, because you want them to quickly overcome the struggle, you might just prevent from them what is for them to discover.
And you're preventing something in yourself, because very often you feel that way because you're uncomfortable with it. And it's a fantastic opportunity to look at yourself. And, why do I react that way? Why do I feel like I need to go help someone when they're not asking for help?
Well, so let me ask you about this, because you said at the beginning that perhaps one of the most salient features or dimensions of a community experience, all of them, is that you get to learn about yourself.
Yes.
What's an example of something that you have learned about yourself through those, many communities experiencing many communities, but specifically the intentional residential community? What's a learning in yourself, or perhaps another way of asking the same question is, what would you say is an example of a development that the community endeavor caused in you? And while you're thinking about that, just to triple down, because you know that I like to ask 3 questions together, specifically about leadership, because you have been involved in a leadership.
Yeah. One of the things I was going to say, Aviv, one of the first things, and then I was going, is that the one I'd say, is what I learned about myself is something in me is a natural leader. And I seem to have always in my life, without attempting to, found myself at the core of things. And it was curious because there's some volunteer work I'm doing right now. And my dear husband one day said to me, "So are you going on their board? Or are you," it was almost like, "Are you going to now be their leader?" It was this sense of, can you just volunteer for something? And I said, I am not looking at getting any more involved than the 2 to 4 times a month I've said I would. And that's it. And I know it. I went into it that way. Yet that was how much he has seen in the many years that he has known me, that I just seem to appear somehow in as leadership. I don't know how, yet it's natural. I don't try to avoid it. And it's something I've had to come to terms with, because it's not that it propels me, definitely. It keeps me on my toes. It allows me such development as a human life. And a lot of that isn't about other people, once again. It's the reflection of myself from other people, and seeing what skills I need that I didn't have at the time. And one of the biggest things I learned about leadership, a friend had said this to me once, and I got it, but I thought I had it and I didn't at the time. It's, if you are going to be an effective leader, you can't want people to like you. It is so true. And what I came to is, it is true. It's what I want to do as a life is be respected, because of the integrity and the way I go on. So I have to earn respect. Being liked is a much lesser thing for me. Yet at times you are hurt by things and you do want to be liked. And you go, well, that's just part of the territory.
The leadership you're describing strikes me as something that arises out of sometimes it's called in the world the idea of servant leadership, but the term has been often used in a narrow way. And what I am deciphering through your story is what appears to have about it an inexhaustible, renewable energy of willingness to serve a purpose, to serve a need, to serve a cause, and to continue forever to nudge it forward. And when, in this case, yourself, you showed up with that natural aptitude and orientation, it's not even that you decide to be a leader, it inducts you to the leadership role or the leadership engagement, because the needs are always greater than the range of resources and willingness that are available around. And if somebody is prepared to be in that crucible of need and the future emerging in an endeavor, they will find themselves on the cutting edge of leadership.
Yes. And then when we say leadership, I mean, that's a very big term that people have all different ideas of its definition, its description, the parameters of it, because leadership doesn't mean being the one out there recognized. It doesn't mean taking credit. It doesn't mean you're a part of the engine, and you might be the initial steam of the engine. You might be the constancy of the engine. Yet another thing I'd say about this intentional community and the aspect of leadership is, it is a community effort. I could not do it without the others, and they might not be able to do it in the same way without me. But I know I could not do it without the others. And everything, how each contributes their uniqueness, their skills, their passions, and they're all an integral part. And sometimes it's taking the lead from that. And how does that instruct you?
So we are partly exploring today this inquiry of communities, about communities, in the context of this time of dramatic change that's unfolding, beginning of the third decade of the 21st century, a year and a half into the pandemic. Perhaps it's in the rearview mirror, perhaps not. And within it is the sense that perhaps we are in the early stages of what might be a decade or a multi-decade dramatic and radical transformation in all sorts of dimensions, economically, geopolitically, socioeconomic fabrics in many countries, and so on. And there is the sense that within it, the prospect of a community, the function and the meaning of a community, again, in different kind of communities, may become more important, and even more so because we seem to be operating now in a world where tremendous amount of study reveals that more people are lonelier than ever, even with early stages of life and the teen years, the anxiety, the depression, because of a variety of trends, including social media, not just that. But this, you talked about what happens when you come to a new land, to a new area. We seem to, in the even broader, larger picture of humanity, we seem to be migrating into new times. And there is a bit of the working hypothesis that community becomes even more important, or potentially can be one of the tools, one of the devices, one of the constructs that will help people be better adaptive and resilient through these times of change. When you hear me describe that, what do you agree with? What do you disagree with? How would you frame it differently? How does it resonate or not?
There's agreement with it. And as you're talking, it made me think of community in so many ways, because there's action communities. There's communities that have an external mission, an internal mission. When I say an action community, they have a message to put across. There's communities that have to do with certain practices, spiritual, religious practices. There's community bringing it even to a neighborhood. How many people today really let's say they live in a city block, an apartment house, do they know their neighbors? How much do they know? Do they know their names? Do they know anything about them? And this takes me back to really the health of children, because I see it as so important in these times going forward, and you're talking about it, that as children, you want to be able to be outside running free, whether it's you're in a city and you're jumping rope and you're playing tag in someone's backyard. This is something that, and you're outside, rather than, as you're saying, virtual culture, the virtual community. And it's where it's not always, where it's free time rather than always scheduled time. And I'm hoping to see that this is something that begins to happen again, where people do get to know their neighbors. And it used to be you needed a cup of milk and you go to your neighbor, but it could be that you're going for a walk, and there's someone you recognize and you say hi to and you have a chat, and what happens in that exchange? It might change your day of that loneliness. And with the children, it's that they grow and learn by playing with other children in free time. And that be available to them, that there be a safety for that. And it's talked about in these times that that safety doesn't exist. Well, it only doesn't exist because we don't create it.
There is a simple argument to make that we are social mammals and that therefore it is natural for us to operate as communities, especially given the tribal nature of our ancestry and lineage in terms of as a species. So, but I propose that when we look at that distant trace, what we will often find is that the operating system of those early tribal societies, they were based in the purpose of survival. So the DNA content that's expressed is largely the survival impulse. And that is one side of the story. And so much of what we're describing now and what you're describing with the idea of purpose-inspired community and intentional community, even if it's an educational community that's simply where the shared aspiration is, we will give a different kind of education to our children where they are more able to freely roam in nature and engaged in that natural blessings of this beautiful place we call Earth, whatever it is. So those are more communities of choice, communities of practice, communities of shared purpose, communities guided by some kind of a shared aspired for future.
Yes.
And in that sense, the two things I'm connecting here, if we look at the evolutionary biology trace, we will say, sure, as a species, we had the advantage, the evolutionary advantage in our capacity to collaborate and coordinate large-scale action. And perhaps that's why we are the inheritors of the supreme position we find ourselves now in the evolutionary story. But put this on the one side and look at what we are now talking about, it appears all of a sudden that in spite of that glorious evolutionary trace, we are not very developed at all in how we come to shared purpose, shared agreement, and shared choice. And partly thinking that we can just lean on that survival impulse is insufficient because in the broader scheme of things, what you are describing, what we are referring to when we talk about evolutionary inclined communities, we are talking about unlocking higher evolutionary function, a community that's not based merely on survival. Sure, if tomorrow there is a doomsday scenario on the planet, do we stand better chance to survive as communities? Yes, but that's again the survival side of the equation. We are sensing into higher evolutionary function, unlocking, unleashing latent human potential, artistic, intellectual, philosophical, spiritual, in any other sense, where we say, what's a way to enable these, the distinction being the early survival-based tribal societies, their consciousness was tribal by nature. Once you talk about a group of adults electing to build together a community like the one you have endeavored and been involved in leadership capacity for many, many years, actually the strength of the community is in people, in a way, liberating themselves from tribal consciousness and showing up to the partnering search from an individuated place. I'm not saying accomplished, but at least on that journey. And it seems to me that the evidence here is that we're still in the very early stages of that kind of development. It's not as though we are very advanced in that journey. We seem to be struggling with the how to approach that prospect. And so I suppose if there is a question at the end of this trace I'm offering and the distinction, which I think is important, is there any chance at all approaching an endeavor like this without development, personal development? The idea of being engaged with personal development as part of your life, is there any chance of doing anything successful without that being right there at the center of the endeavor? And I'm obviously revealing my bias in that I'm answering my own question, but I'm interested, what would you say to that?
It needs to be alongside of it. The one I would say is, for something to be successful, it needs to be greater than oneself. So it's the service aspect. And then that the development happens from that, because it's not development, human development, personal development for development's sake. Yet it's because I want to serve a greater purpose as a life. So there's something, and I'll give an example of where it's not that way, something that you might hear people as they get older not wanting to pay the taxes for, let's say, education for primary, kindergarten through 12th grade, because they don't have children in school anymore. So it's from a very personal place rather than the fact of we want to find, and I'm not saying education is the best example, but I want to be part of giving the youth an opportunity to be the leadership of the future. There's a difference in mindset. So that's where that's why I'd say the personal development is an integral part. And there needs to be the willingness for it to be a success, but it's not the primary.
Since you mentioned the word success, let me ask in a different way. How do we know that a community is succeeding? Is it something that we know by the presence of something, or is it that we know that something is succeeding by what is not present there, by what is absent there? What is your experience? At what point were you able to say we are succeeding, we're doing well, we are thriving?
It's both. It's by what is there and by what's not there. And it's curious. We learn more from people who come to visit than we do not, because we live in it every day. So you become familiar with it. Yet others come, and someone might have been here 3 years ago, and then they come 2 weeks ago, let's say, or, over a different time span. And it's what they feel and what they sense and what they see as absent. That's part of it, as well, the well-being of the people.
What would be an example of what is and what is absent that tells you that it is a success? You just started saying the well-being of people is one important marker.
The well-being of people. The sense, I'll give an example, the sense of when people come, they might think, wow, I'd love to live there. I'm not saying they will or won't, because they get along. They don't talk behind each other's backs. It's simple things like that. What they feel when they come onto the land. Some people say, people I've never met before, would say, is this a sanctuary? So it's what comes and emanates from the land because of the way we are that as well tells us. There's, I could go into many aspects from there. There's the willingness of people. That's part of it. An example, even just the other day, here we are in COVID time still, and we're cautious. People go out to work. Some people are vaccinated already. Some aren't. And so we were, as I was saying, we just moved offices, and we were moving office, and put out a note and saying, not asking who's coming, but just to put out a note and saying, we need these men, we need some trucks, and here's the time. And we had more people and trucks than needed. Everyone was turning out because they want to see things move forward. And people want to get together. That shows part of the success.
So the spirit of willingness, the spirit of volunteering, and the camaraderie of purpose is always an indicator that something is vibrantly renewing itself in and through the collective endeavor. Just to stay for a minute with this practice you mentioned twice, which is not talking behind people's back. And by the way, when I teach that in corporate settings, I explain to people that if there are 6 of us at the table and one of us leaves the table and the 5 of us talk behind his or her back, you know that when you're going to leave the table, people are going to talk behind your back. But I gather there is an even deeper awareness that you bring to it in the collective, which is I'm intuiting a sense of, number one, if you have to say something to somebody, say it to them directly. And because that will force you to, even if you want to create a gentle resistance or work through differences, that will force you to discover how can you do that while you hold the best of the person at the same time. So there is that part of the practice. And there is the awareness that if you start talking behind people's back, you essentially poison the waterways of the collective, because you never know where else it flows. And once you put the poison in the water, that same poison will come back at you. So if you say we want to build a healthy, vital community, it begins with practicing those kind of awarenesses and behavioral sciences that will bring forward the best in each other and will set in motion the most robust, healthiest ways of dealing with each other, which is not easy because people go through struggle, and there may be divorce, and there may be other family struggles, and all the rest of it.
And you stay out of it, and you don't take sides. And as well, as you were saying that, it's if you came to me and were starting to talk about someone in a way that was would weaken them or was not supporting them, it's for me to say to you, take that to them, not to me, please. Or look at why this is bothering you.
So 2 questions to brings us to a pause, because there is so much more to explore. And I'm going to present them both so you can choose which one do you want to respond to and in what order. Question 1, so if, and in some way you addressed it, but I'll ask it again. If you had a small gathering of half a dozen people showing up next week at your front door and say, hey, will you sit with us for a few minutes and chat to us about what advice? We are in our early 30s and we want to build a residential community that will promote the best of human development and the best in each other and provide a healthy and robust ecology for the children that we want to raise, and will also honor the environment, and will at the same time look to be a community that's not inhibiting on its members and individuals, but rather one that is supportive and liberating. What advice would you offer them? That's question 1. And question 2, more for you. What is it you're looking for in the next 5 to 10 years in terms of your community endeavors?
I'll start with the first, and you only gave me 2, my gosh. So I'll start with the first one. The first thing that comes to mind is, would you like me to mentor you? Because it's not a this answer and that answer. It is, and then I would say, take your time before you break ground, so to speak. Get to know one another some. Establish what is the purpose of what you're doing as core and broad as you can. And in doing so, as another aspect is, don't have rules. No rules. Have some ways and means that are addressed and that are agreed upon and that are looked at regularly. Regularly doesn't mean every day, every month. It could be, it's saying that they're open to be updated. So those are the three things I would say. A lot of patience, allowance. I mean, I could go on and on with what are the different things you would say. And the main thing is I was saying, no matter what anyone says for you, it will be very unique for you.
Yeah. And this emphasis again on not having rules, I hear as an invitation to be rigorously soft rather than rigorously hard and brittle.
Yes.
Because you're dealing with the most delicate and the most resilient thing of all, which is human life. And we go through changes, and we only know of ourselves what we know today. And as we embark on a journey like this, it's a journey within a journey within a journey, because there is the individual journey, and there is often the family journey, and there is the journey of the community together. And if you don't allow the space and the humanity and the encouragement and ultimately the conviction that we can work through difficulties, if you try to preemptively solve to all possible difficulties, you will impose on yourself the hard rigor rather than soft rigor. And the second question?
That one's much simpler in ways. I'm in the process of mentoring someone into the leadership areas that I've been with over the last 17 years. And I would say that a space is being created for what those next steps will be. And at this time, it is not known what it is. I don't have, I'm looking to do this. Well, I shouldn't say that. I have so many things on my list that I'd like to see happen. Yet, I am not jumping on any of them and leaving a space to let it instruct me what's next.
Yeah, very poignant, because sometimes the best way to create space for somebody else to grow into a space you occupied is to unlock your own growth, to allow yourself to move into a new space. So you are now occupied in the next new endeavor or octave of your own journey. And so while you're being siphoned into that space, that helps you create a space for somebody else. Is there anything else before we press the pause on this that you feel you want to impart on the significance, the power, the richness, the glorious beauty and the pain, all at the same time, the agony and the ecstasy of
That was the term, yes, the agony and the ecstasy
of a community endeavor?
I think it says a lot about myself. I don't see an agony to it. The only agony is in the resistance of one's own development. So that would be the agony, is that internal resistance. Because and the other is instead of talking about the ecstasy in the way most people would think about it, for me, the ecstasy is more the potential of what something can be that is not yet revealed.
Yeah, no, I think it's important to note that when we use the word ecstasy, in to the best of my knowledge from your endeavor, we are not talking about psychedelic ecstasy.
No.
We're talking which has its own place and purpose if you choose to. We're talking more about the ecstasy that is realized in the communion of purpose, in the communion of significance, in the communion of shared discovery.
And saying that the ecstasy is that I see that it has a future, that each step opens up more of. And if I looked at a picture, or if I was able to transport myself to 18 years ago and stand on this land and walk around it, and then today, the ecstasy is in that. The transformation, what is, as we were saying, what is and isn't here, what lives in the trees, what lives in the land, what between the people, what lives. And you can say the fabric that has been woven that were threads not put together before.
That's awesome.
And it's still on the loom.
Thank you. That's an awesome place to bring it to pause. Thank you very much, Jane.
Thank you.